Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here with us and taking part of that webinar from Infrastructure Victoria, where we will present to you and discuss the findings of our latest research report, Fair Move, Better Public Transport Fares for Melbourne. Before we begin the official proceedings, I would like to acknowledge that our webinar is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Now, as a bit of a context, you would know that Infrastructure Victoria, since we started 5 years ago, have been really present and active in pushing the debate around a better public transport network system. And we've conducted research on transport network efficiency. One of the top 3 transformative recommendations in the first ever 30-year infrastructure strategy tabled in Parliament in 2016 was to consider and implement an efficient and fair transport network pricing system. And we've been active pushing for that fundamental reform ever since. Lately, in March of this year, we published another seminal report in order to demonstrate the benefits and the needs to consider this reform, not just from a road pricing angle, but also looking at public transport fares reform and also parking, to really consider it as an ecosystem. So today we will present to you the findings specifically around the reform that we feel are very important to consider for public transport fares. And we absolutely acknowledge that the timing of release of this report is very particular due to the COVID environment. But as you will see from the presentation, we certainly feel very strongly that the time is right, the time is now to consider and implement those recommendations, and we certainly have our favorites among the list that we'll present to you, in order to make sure that when we transition to the post-COVID, we do not go back to the world that we've experienced in the past. COVID is the mother of all crises, and we certainly consider at Infrastructure Victoria that this opens up the mother of all opportunities. And we feel certainly very strongly that it is our duty, through the release of this report, through the release of the draft infrastructure strategy later on this year, to make sure that we influence the decisions from the governments and provide recommendations with the benefit of your input in order to make sure that we go back to a better normal. And that's really the essence of what we are going to present to you today. So to begin today's session, Jonathan Spear and Daniel Harrison will step you through a presentation that we put to that effect. And then we will open up the webinar for questions, and Neil will be the master of ceremony in directing those questions. So just a couple of housekeeping formalities before I hand over to Jonathan. If you could please ensure that you mute your microphones, and please type any questions that you have in the discussion panel, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. Of course, we are on Twitter, #InfraVic, and LinkedIn, so please feel free to continue the conversation on social media. And we're certainly looking forward to that interaction with you. We made it very clear that the release of this report was the beginning of a discussion, not the end of a discussion. So we're certainly very much looking forward to get your reaction. On that note, I would like now to hand over to our Deputy CEO, Jonathan Spear, and Project Director on this cracking piece of work, Daniel Harrison, to run through the key findings. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Michelle, and good morning to you all. And thanks for joining us, and really looking forward to the discussion we're going to have later on. I'll give a bit of an introduction further to what Michelle has been saying, and then Daniel will take us through some of the detail of this piece of work. What I'll do is in particular focus on, well, why do this now? What is the importance of public transport reform in our current context? And as Michelle was saying, we've been doing work on public transport and transport network pricing reform and road pricing for some years now. If I can have the next slide, please, Daniel. The Good Move report that we released earlier this year is really an important part of this overall context, because what we have been able to do is release work that is focused upon the ability to change people's behaviour and give people greater choice, and part of that is through the prices that we pay for public transport, for roads, and for parking. And that Good Move report is the one we released earlier this year, and now we have Fair Move. Fair Move is focused upon public transport reform in Melbourne. And I want to acknowledge that there are other elements of regional public transport fares that probably also require some consideration, but this piece of work was focused upon metropolitan public transport fare reform. And there's 4 key themes that you see in this work. We looked closely at how you can improve how fares are set. And we think that fares should be set transparently and with clear objectives. And the sort of objectives that we think make sense is a combination of making the best use of the public transport network, but also taking equity into account so you can drive fairness of outcomes and ensuring that people can make a really good informed travel choice in the way the fare system is designed. We also think that fares should reflect the mode of travel, so that there should be different fare levels for trains, trams, and buses. And Daniel will talk us through soon the basis on which we come to that conclusion. And we make recommendations about implementing fares that reflect the time and place of travel, and in particular, the importance of having greater use of peak and off-peak pricing. Finally, we think that there's quite a lot of opportunity to improve ticketing, which can support fare reform outcomes, but also enhance the travel experience and contribute to better use of the network. So we think that this sort of reform, particularly having off-peak and more mode-based pricing, it's good policy reform at any time. But actually right now, as Melbourne emerges from a COVID restrictions, we think that fare reform offers some really big additional important opportunities. Firstly, it can have a role in the economic recovery, because cheaper fares and reductions that come from both off-peak travel and lower tram and bus fares can encourage people to return to the Melbourne CBD and to other shopping centres, and that will help support Melbourne's economic recovery. And those cheaper fares and those off-peak fares will benefit households that are on the lowest income the most, and Daniel will take us through those findings later on. And so at the time when people are doing it quite tough with the economic conditions, we think it is fair and reduces the cost of living for us to take the sort of approach to public transport fares that we are advocating. Thirdly, we think that having a fare system that encourages people to think about the time that they travel and whether they can travel off-peak is part of the recipe to help support social distancing as Melbourne looks to resume going back to work and study and shopping and other trips. And if people can be thinking about and being rewarded for taking trips off peak when it's less crowded, that can really help. And finally, of course, there is a real opportunity to more efficiently reuse the public transport system. Our findings are that these public transport fare reforms have the effect of reducing car trips and also increasing public transport trips. So as it becomes the right time to do so, we can spread the demand, avoid the crowding, but also avoid congestion on the roads at peak times. So next slide, thank you, Daniel. And what I'll do now is hand over to Daniel Harrison, who's probably the project director leading this work, and he'll take you through both the definition of the problems that we've identified and also the solutions that we've modelled. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Jonathan, and apologies for those slides. Got a few technical issues here, but hopefully from here on it'll be smooth. So when we started this project, we initially were looking at 3 issues. The first one was that the public transport network is under strain, but it's also out of balance. So if you think about it, if you look at the network usage, you can see there's a really high peak in the AM and the PM, where the network is under a lot of strain. And for those of us who use public transport frequently, there was a lot of crowding. And then in the off-peak times, public transport network was really, really underused. They run less services, and even those services aren't full. We also found that fares didn't encourage the best use of the network or give people choice for when they travel. So essentially, despite the fact that there was high peaks and low troughs, people weren't given any kind of price discount to shift their time of travel. It costs you the same to use the train, the tram, or the bus, regardless of what time you're traveling or what mode you're traveling by. We also found that the current system was unfair, and we have concessions, which is an important part of the public transport fare system. But beyond that, there was actually some structural improvements that could be made to make it fairer, and we'll get to that in a minute. But essentially, we found that the modes that we recommend be priced lower are also those modes used by people on lower incomes, and that those times of day which we recommend should be priced lower are also used by people who are on average lower incomes. So we kind of had to think about this and say, well, how do we set fares? Because it's a complex question. If you just say, well, let's just have more public transport, then there are problems with that because you get more and more crowding and congestion on public transport and less service reliability. But if you want to say, well, let's just move people off public transport, then you have the significant issue of road congestion, but you also have the significant issue of lower health benefits from less walking, more pollution, and other environmental costs like increased carbon emissions. So you really got to balance a whole range of different things. And the way we decided to do this was to come up with this methodology, which has been used by other agencies around the world, including IPART in New South Wales. But basically it says, let's set public transport fares so that they take account of the many social impacts from public transport use. And we do that at the margin, so at the additional trip. So it's called the social marginal cost pricing approach, but basically how it does this is it says, well, let's look at all the costs to society from adding new services. So new infrastructure, new services, new trains, operating costs. If you want to add new trips to the network, these are some of the costs that we're going to incur. But then from that, we need to take account of, well, what are the benefits of those trips? And so you have to remove from that, well, there's congestion benefits off the road. There's pollution and accident benefits on the road that need to be taken account of, and there's health benefits for people who use public transport as well. And if you take the difference between these two things, you end up with an approximation of what is the optimal fare. And so the way that this was done, we CIE and Jacobs did some modelling work for us, and they modelled a 30% fare reduction, and then they looked at what the demand change was for that, and then looked at the costs of those additional trips on the network. So what did we find? Well, we found that in the peak, there was obviously higher costs, but it varied by mode. So on the right there, you can see that additional train travel has high costs, followed by tram and then bus. So train is the most expensive, and that's because it's the most congested pre-COVID-19. And it's also very expensive to add more services. It usually involves new infrastructure. Trams was lower, because it's not quite as expensive to add new services. And then buses were particularly cheap, and that's because buses are underused across the whole network. So adding additional passengers doesn't cost very much because in many cases you don't actually need a new service. And in those cases where you do need a new service, the cost of adding an additional bus is relatively low cost compared to train and tram. So this evidence brought us to the conclusion that we should have different prices based on what mode you use. But what was interesting was looking at the equity impacts of this. We found that public transport use also varied with mode by income quintiles. So households who were on high incomes tended to use on average those train and tram services, whereas bus services were used more by people on lower incomes. You can see in the chart there that the lowest 20% of income users make up 27% of bus, whereas they only make up 15% of train. So we see there's some real equity benefits here by having mode-based fares. And there's also a fairness aspect in that if you think about the different reasons people use these modes, they also vary, and we'll get to that. But essentially, short bus trips, they should, if you ask the average person, should probably cost less than a long city trip on the train at peak hour. Looking at the time of day, obviously there's a lot less congestion in the off-peak, and so adding additional passengers is relatively low cost. So this is particularly acute for train, where there's massive amounts of excess capacity in the off-peak periods, and so adding additional passengers is very cheap, and they still provide benefits in road congestion. And so for all the modes, we've recommended off-peak fares, except for buses, which are underutilized a lot of the time, and particularly in the peak, have high congestion benefits. So therefore, you kind of comes out as a wash. So we think they should be more or less low all throughout the day. Once again, we find that from an equity point of view, people who are using the off-peak public transport are on lower incomes on average, and those using the peak are on higher incomes on average. And so not only is there some real efficiency gains to be had here, but there's also equity improvements as well. We also had a range of ticketing reforms that we prepared, and a lot of these were to pave the way for the reforms that we've just mentioned around mode-based pricing and peak and off-peak. Before we get to that, I just mentioned, because I've skipped over it, we also talked about location. So pricing should also be by location, because there are different levels of congestion on the network in different places. So for example, if you're living in zone 2 and you're taking the train, even at peak hour, a trip within zone 2 is relatively uncongested on the train. So you can get on the train and get off the train, and you're not really adding to congestion. Congestion mostly occurs when you get to the CBD, and particularly where you cross that boundary from zone 1 and into what we're calling the city zone, which we now know is basically the city loop and future metro tunnel. And that's where the main congestion impact is. But it's important to note that we're recommending lower fares for trips inside zone 2 and even inside just zone 1, but then higher fares for those who are crossing over from zone 1 into the future city zone. However, that city zone is not something we're recommending should be done now. And the reason for that is, well, we're not seeing that level of congestion because COVID-19 has really changed the way that we're using public transport and the networks. And we only think that that city zone should be introduced when and if congestion gets that really high level. So just to be clear, that's not something that we're suggesting be done now or in the current environment. So our ticketing reforms, looking at different countries around the world, we don't fare all that well in our ticketing, and Mikey's been around for quite a while, and there is some room for improvements. Some of these can be done immediately, and others we're going to have to do further down the track, and there's a real opportunity in 2023 when the ticketing contract comes up once again. So a few of the things that we're talking about here is mobility as a service. So this would enable people to be able to book and pay for their trips across Melbourne with a third party, and that integrate uses such as taxis or Uber with public transport and even bicycle share schemes. And you could pay for your trip, book your trip on one app, and then it would be able to use that app to access all the different forms of transport. But at the moment, our ticketing system doesn't allow third parties, and so we want to open that up. We also want to look at the way that Mikey passes are used, and also reducing the fee for the Mikey card itself so that it's cheaper to access the network. So let's just talk quickly about some transport modeling. So what are the impacts from our reforms? So we use the Melbourne model to show us what the impacts would be on our network in the year 2036. in order to do this, we had to give the Melbourne activity-based model a new fare table. And so this is it. Essentially for tram and express bus, it's fairly straightforward. It's $2.50 in the peak and then $1.25 in the off-peak period. For bus, it's $1.25 at all times of the day, as we discussed earlier. There's no peak and off-peak fare for bus. For train, you've got those 3 different zones. And if you're traveling within zone 2 only, it's $2.50, which is the off-peak price. And then traveling within only one zone, or zone 1 and 2, is $4. But those high cost trips where you're going into the city zone from another zone, they're priced at $5. As you can see on the right-hand side there, there's a little map of what we propose to be the new city zone when and if crowding and congestion return. That's what we modeled. The peak times are 7:30 to 9:30 a.m. and that's for arrivals. So it's only if you arrive at those times, and then for departures at 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. There's also a directional discount. So if you're traveling in the off-peak direction, so it's the AM peak and you're traveling away from the city, then you pay the off-peak fare. And for multimodal, we've modeled bus fares will be free with a train, and then train combinations, you pay a small $1.25 fee to use the tram on top of the train. So let's look at the results. What we found was there were 30,000 fewer peak train boardings, which is equivalent to 27 new high capacity metro trains, which was a really encouraging sign. And we saw 100,000 new off-peak boardings, which is really great. So this is like all win, because this is where we're using a network we already have, it's underused, and suddenly we have 100,000 new boardings. We had 93 extra bus boardings, again, which is really what we wanted to see, because that was a mode that was not being used very much, particularly in the outer suburbs, and it was good to see that increased. We also saw, if you look at the AM PM peak, that the peak reduced, so that the people were now having a more reliable service and less crowded service, and use in the off-peak was increased. So we're basically shifting some of the load from that point of strain to those times where there's more capacity on the network. Now, looking at the effect on people and what they pay, we found that 71% of users would pay less than they currently do to use the public transport network. And that's a pretty significant point and a pretty significant improvement for users. We found that particularly benefited people on the lowest incomes. So those in the lower income quintiles paid on average 26% less. And as you can see in the chart below, where you've got basically by LGA, well, areas of Melbourne, so inner metro, east, inner south, and north, you've got who's paying more or less with the fare reform, and you've also got it by the income quintile. So you can see that the people in the lowest income quintile have the greatest savings, and the people on the highest are the ones saving the least. And it's important to note here also that 71% of people are paying less or about the same, though there's not a lot of people paying much more, and particularly when we're not implementing that city zone, most people benefit. We also find that by having peak and off-peak pricing and mode-based pricing, that there are benefits to the wider Victorian community. So there's $520 million of benefit across the Victorian community, and that's through more transport pricing options, reduced crowding and congestion on the roads, and better environmental outcomes. What was also interesting is that you can see that for those lowest income quintiles, the people who shifted the most from the car to public transport were those on the lowest incomes, because they've got a real saving there and they made that switch. And so that was something that was also important to see, and to show that this peak and off-peak pricing was really benefiting those people on lower incomes, not just for those who were already using public transport in the off-peak and getting a discount, but for people who were using their cars previously and were now shifting to public transport because it was cheaper. Looking at the network effects, we had 56,000 new public transport users, and we had 96,000 less car trips across the network. And you can see in the different maps there, we've got train passenger volumes in the AM peak was reduced across the network, whereas bus passenger volumes increased, which is what we want because that network was being underused. So I'm just going to whip through our recommendations now, and this one will give, I guess, more clarity on some of those ticketing recommendations we talked about earlier. The first one was that we want public transport fares set transparently using clearly defined objectives. And this is because at the moment, the way the fares are set aren't against clear criteria. And we want that to be a transparent process and for people to know why fares are going to be set the way that they are. We think the objective should be to make the best use of the transport network, to take equity into account and to ensure people are provided with informed travel choices, which is really a way of saying that they understand the price mechanisms. We also would like government to immediately appoint an independent body to advise and monitor transport prices. And we think that having a body like they have in New South Wales that gives advice to government on how fares should be set, again, provides that more transparent process that we talked about earlier, and also, gives government information that it currently doesn't have. We're not recommending that this agency set the fares, but that they recommend what they should be. We also want to immediately introduce different fares on each public transport mode to reflect the costs and benefits and encourage their best use. We want to abolish the free tram zone to improve safety and access for those who need it most. So if you think about the reforms that we're doing, this is a natural progression. So we're pricing all the different modes differently. The free tram zone isn't priced, but it is really congested. And so we don't see that as a logical step to keep that happening. We also found that there weren't big benefits to tourism and that the benefits were also unevenly distributed. So the centre of Melbourne was benefiting, but outside of that, other people and other businesses weren't benefiting. And so it was unfair. But really the main thing at this point in time is it's just not safe during the current COVID-19 pandemic to encourage people to cram onto those CBD trams, particularly because those people who are more vulnerable or who don't have good mobility, they need those trams to be safe and uncrowded and easy to get on and off, and the free tram zone isn't helping with that. We also want to introduce peak and off-peak fares, which I think we've talked about quite a bit, and also consider a new city zone, but again, only when and if crowding increases to the levels that we saw pre-coronavirus. We also want to introduce directional pricing so that people traveling in off-peak directions are paying the off-peak fare. Talking about ticketing, we want to reduce and remove the Myki card purchase fee, which we talked about earlier, and allow other inputs for ticketing validation. So people can pay with their credit cards, their debit cards, and they can touch on off with those, which is something that New South Wales has brought in rather recently. We want to open up the ticketing system to third parties, and that's to enable the kind of rollout of mobility as a service, giving people more choice about how they book and plan their journeys. We want to discontinue the Myki Pass. And the reason, and the Myki Pass, for those of you who aren't aware of what that is an unlimited travel over a set period of time for a fixed price. And we want to do this to facilitate fare reform and to remove complexity. So 42% of people who use Myki Money don't know what Myki Pass even is. And we found that, interestingly, people who were on Myki Money, some of them should be on a pass because it would be cheaper, but there are people on passes that should be on Myki Money because it would be cheaper. And interestingly, across concessions, Myki Pass holders on average pay more than people using Myki Money. So we think that that's a very complex system, but the main issue is that it also gets in the way of our fare reform. You can't have peak and off-peak fares if you're paying a flat fee for using it for a month or a year. You also can't have mode-based prices. So we think that getting rid of that will enable those other benefits to happen and will also reduce the complexity and confusion. We want to review the level of the daily cap. So currently, if you're using Myki Money, there's a daily cap that you can't go over. And so we just want to have government look at that and go, well, is it too high? Is it too low? What should be the optimum amount? So we want to encourage people to think about the way they're using the network so they don't hit the cap too early. We also don't want it to be so if someone's usually using the network a lot, there's a prohibitively high maximum cost. And finally, we want to develop a set of principles to guide concession design. So looking at concession, particularly free travel days, there's a few inconsistencies, and we'd like to see government come up with some clear principles about what should and shouldn't be in, and then go through and have a review of the concessions. removing or adding them as necessary. So that concludes my presentation. So we'll bring back everyone else and we'll have some Q&A time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Daniel and Jonathan, for that presentation. I have to say, I've seen it quite a while, but I'm always learning something. So credit to all of you. So we're now going to move to the questions from you, the audience, and Neil is going to be our air traffic controller in respect of those questions. And Daniel, Jonathan, and Neil will respond to those. So Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. I definitely do as well look like a traffic air controller with the microphones here. So hello, everyone. As we mentioned earlier, feel free to put those questions that you have into the discussion panel. And so the first question we've received from our audience is from Councillor Jackie Fristacchi from the City of Yarra. Daniel, I might go to you with this one first. So the question is, how do IV's proposals account for pricing to support intermodal and multimodal trips being a frequent and beneficial part of an integrated transport system? So this is talking about those trips, you know, the short trips of connecting trips of bus and tram to train stations, for example. It's vital not to discourage these types of multimodal trips. So Daniel, how do IV's proposals support these multimodal trips?
Yep, thanks, Neil. I think the first thing to note is that through these reforms, a lot of these modes are now cheaper across all modes and particularly off-peak times. And for the kind of access to the network, I think it's a really important question because we don't want to penalise people from taking a bus to the train station. So the way we've resolved that here is we've said, well, if you're taking a bus and a train, then the bus is free. And the reason we've done that is not only for kind of those multimodal reasons and making the network accessible, which is a good reason in and of itself, but also because those buses do provide such high benefits and they are so underused. And we also don't want people to be driving to those car parks for those stations, which are already, you know, overfull. So why not allow them to take the bus, reduce the road congestion, use the underused bus and take the train trip. And so I think that also resolves that access issue because for a lot of people, you know, train stations which give you that quick, efficient trip to the CBD aren't easily accessible, and that bus kind of solves that. For tram, what we've done is there's a small fee for a tram-train combination, and that's really about balancing the network effect. So tram is quite crowded, and there's a lot of those trips that can also be done by active transport, particularly for those people who are taking the train to the CBD. They get off, and then it's a short walk to the office, or at the moment, a free tram. And those free trams are super crowded. And so what we want to do is make people think, oh, if it's not far, I'll take that walk instead and reduce the amount of congestion in those trams, making them, you know, safer and also more reliable as well. So I think we've really tried to balance that. But I guess my main point would be at the end of the day, we really tried to make those multimodal trips as easy as possible. And it's particularly for those bus train combinations that there's no cost at all for using that bus.
Neil, before you move on to the next question, can I maybe anticipate one of the questions that are going to be thrown to you to make an important point? And that is that the emphasis, of course, on our fares reform is on lower fares in some modes and the introduction of peak fares. This does not translate into lesser revenue for the state. In other words, what we've modeled is roughly revenue neutral because the lower fares impact is compensated by the increased volume, increased patronage on the public transport. And Daniel mentioned that we've got 56,000 additional trips for every weekday. So please keep in mind that this reform is roughly revenue neutral, and that was something that indeed was very important for us to consider in the current fiscal constraint, in the current funding structure already of the public transport in Victoria.
Thanks, Michelle. So I've got a series of questions around fares now, and I believe so we've actually got a question from Andy, and it was just a question around what's the thinking behind that additional fee. I think Andy, Daniel may have answered a bit of that in his response just then. So Daniel, I've got another one on fares. You outlined the social marginal pricing approach, were there other alternatives or other approaches or filters that you used in developing the fare structures that we came up with?
Yeah, so just to be clear, Neil, were there other options, or were there other options that we did actually use?
Were there other approaches? There's the social marginal cost approach, but were there other considerations that you had in mind when setting these fares?
Sure. Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, so the social marginal cost kind of developed the groundwork, I suppose, kind of that's the basis. But then, you know, we kept our minds open that that's the starting point. So yes, okay, that's an efficient network, but there are lots of other things that we need to think about, right? And one of those things is, well, maybe it's efficient, but is it usable? Is it user friendly? Will people understand it? And that was a really important part of our work. And so we did a range of studies. We got SGS, Economics and Planning, and the Behavioural Insights team to do a experimental study, which was really interesting, and a literature review to say, well, what parts of the fare system do people find complicated, and how much complexity is too much? And so that was a real constraint in thinking that we had going throughout this, was how do we make this a usable system while still being something that can make the best use of the network? And then the next big question was, well, you can have a network that's making the best use, and you can make it so it's understandable so people aren't confused by it, but is it fair? Is it equitable? And this became a big bulk of our research. And I think we've probably done what, as far as I'm aware, is some of the most extensive kind of equity research on public transport anywhere that I've seen. And we looked at, well, who's using different modes at different times, and what income quintile are they in for households? And what we found was very interesting, because while we initially thought, well, we might have to adjust things to try and take equity into account, but in the main, the vast majority of the things that made better use of the network also helped people who needed the help the most. They also lowered the fares for people on the lowest incomes. And so we found that was really quite surprising, which is why we believe that concessions actually isn't enough, because if you have concessions, that's great, you get a discount and that covers all people. But then there's also, you know, these structural changes that can mean that those people are paying less for the base fare as well. And so equity was a real focus of our work.
Thanks, Daniel. So let's I've got a few questions around more spatial aspects of our proposals here. So Jonathan, I might throw this one to you now. Given that 70% of Melbourne being beyond the effective reach of trams or trains and relies on infrequent bus services, so we're focusing on the bus network now, how can fare pricing encourage that shift to buses? The question is around, you know, some bus services are deficient in coverage and frequency. Is it really a rational option to shift people to that mode? How does fare reform encourage that shift, Jonathan?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that we've given quite a lot of thought to, both in the course of doing this work and also in other streams of IV's work. And the thing is that you've got the opportunity for fare reform to make much greater use of the existing and planned bus system, but also we would certainly agree that there is opportunity to improve bus services. And so I'll talk about both of those things. So, you know, what our findings are from the Fair Move report is that the bus system, as it stands, is heavily underutilised, except for some small areas of the system in peak periods. And there is a real opportunity to make better use of that system through lowering the fares so they're consistently low for buses, you know, $1.25, as Daniel was explaining. And what we find is that that does result in a lot more people using buses. And you get that very significant shift. And not only does that better use that, but it gives people better choice, and people are saving money. So rather than take the car, they can pay $1.25 to go to the shops or to get access to a train station, rather than paying $4.50 for that journey. They're paying $1.25. And it is the people who are least well off that are making the greatest use of that. And we think that that is also really much fairer and giving those people much greater transport accessibility, which is a problem that we'd really like to fix. So having said that, our work has found that there are certainly opportunities to improve the bus system. We've published a report called 5-Year Focus, and that's available on our website if any members of the audience are interested. And that found that there were areas of Melbourne where there was opportunity to realign bus services and improve the quality of that service. And there are also, consistent with this one, the findings of this report, really underutilised areas. And so we think that that combination of ongoing service reform of the buses with fare reform is the direction we should be going. And the research that we've done about the decisions people make, and that Daniel was referring to, that SGS and the Behavioural Insights team did, that shows us that fares are important, but not the only part of how people make their decisions. So this is, if you like, two complementary streams of reform that need to happen. Fare reform is something that can be done now, and it can be done quite quickly. And we also think that there should be improvements to the bus system over time as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. Daniel, I'll throw back to you now, and we're talking about some zones and the fare structure that we've proposed here. So this is a question from Martin Chin. Martin asks, did the study consider using more zones and hence more fare categories? So what comes to my mind is, obviously you mentioned that city zone earlier. Alternatively, what about charging by the distance travelled? Example, like the number of stops covered, like in Singapore, for example. So Daniel.
Yeah, so we did look at all of the above, and we looked at zones for buses, for trams, for trains, and we found that because of the way trips are made, it was really train that got the most benefit from having different zones, because it does essentially just fill up along the line as it heads towards the city. That's a very clear progression. And so we really looked at that, and we looked at the social marginal costs kind of by location, and kind of came to the conclusion that, yeah, in the outer areas, very low cost. For trips, even in the middle areas where you're kind of getting on the train, but you're getting off before the CBD, you're actually freeing up space for people to get on to get to the CBD. So we had slightly lower prices there. And so it was really that final city zone, which again, we're not implementing now because coronavirus, but essentially that was the tipping point. And we didn't find that for bus or tram. So, and particularly also those bus and tram trips are generally much shorter trips as well. And on distance, we looked at distance because if you recall from our transport network pricing paper, the illustrative bit about fares in there did include some distance. We had a whole kind of network of things going on, and we did some kind of thorough research on distance itself. And what we found was it was kind of inconclusive as to how much relationship there was between distance and the social marginal costs of those trips. And what we found was that SGS and the Behavioural Insights team found that people really struggle with distance as a fare concept. Like that was the one that tipped them over the edge most times. And so our conclusion was that it wasn't worth the complexity of distance to have that in the fare system for the benefits that it provided. So we didn't include that. So I think that more or less covers all the things that we considered.
Thanks, Daniel. Michel, I might throw this one back to you. There's obviously been a lot of consultation with this work that we've undertaken. What's been the reaction to the work from government, from stakeholders that you've spoken to?
Okay, well, let's start with the government, which made an announcement that they would consider our recommendations, and that's as good as it gets in respect of IV making strong recommendations to the government, and then the government having the choice to follow those recommendations or not. The last thing we want is a knee-jerk reaction to some of our recommendations, keeping in mind that when we release a piece of research like this one, this is the beginning of a discussion, and really the conversation with all of you, with the community, with the stakeholders, so that it's not just us informing or trying to influence the government, but all of us being convinced of the virtues and the benefits of this. And indeed, we saw some pretty strong voices supporting our recommendations and our approach. And we had the Australian Retail Association very strongly and publicly supporting our recommendations through a media release the day when we released our report, but also some very strong support from the Victorian Chamber of Commerce or the RCD. And really what that told us is that the story around this reform, especially what Jonathan was presenting at the beginning, the very strong economic recovery approach that we had in mind, has hit a chord and has really had some resonance with the public and with the key stakeholders. And in essence, when you look at the recommendations that we're putting to you today, what it means is that in the current COVID context, it aims at bringing many more people to the CBD or to the employment and activity centres, whilst at the same time, and this is the whole essence behind our recommendation to remove the free tram zone, while making it safer for these people who have come to the city to get around once they are in the city. And looking at other jurisdictions, looking at sentiments from people, from visitors, it is very clear that the number one aspect that they will take into consideration before coming back to the public transport is that safety aspect. So everything in COVID is about economic recovery and safety, and you put the balance either one way or the other one. We clearly had this trade-off in mind in putting together our portfolio reforms, and we made that stance that lower fares through the off-peak, lower fares on mode, counter-directional, would actually help bringing people back to the city to enjoy an evening out at a fraction of the price of what it would cost them, would bring people back to the city to enjoy shopping during the weekend at a fraction of the cost of what it costs them today. And removing the free tram zone provides them with that safety, with that comfort, with that confidence that they will actually be able to get around once they're there, whilst providing choices. And the example that I use is that I can walk a couple of blocks along Collins Street without any problem, but my 80-year-old mum cannot. And for her, being able to go on the tram in the current and likely future circumstances where she wants to feel safe and comfortable is of absolute essence. Just providing that choice, that price signal, am I ready to pay $1.25 just to go a couple of blocks? Actually, no, I'll walk. And you know what? That's actually good for my health also. But that $1.25, some people will actually be happy to pay that price because what they will get is social distancing, comfort, and a feeling of safety, which at the end of the day, today and in the current future, is the number one criteria to take into consideration to bring people back and safely onto the public transport, especially for those who really need to have access to that public transport.
Thanks, Michel. Now, I want to shift questions around looking at MyKey and the future of MyKey. So I've got a good question here from Ben Mason, and it's around mobility as a service. So Jonathan, I think this one will be pretty good for you. Please, could you provide more detail on the recommendation to open up ticketing to third parties to help enable mobility as a service, MAS? How would this work in practice? Would third parties pay the full fare or receive a wholesale discount? How could you see this happening, and how would it work?
Yeah, so good question. Thank you, Ben. So let me first explain mobility as a service so we're on the same page with that. So that is your ability using an app to book and plan and pay for a journey end to end through the one app, even though you might be using multiple modes to do so. And one of its features and appeals is that it allows you to make a much more informed choice about when and on what mode you might travel, and to be able to trade off things like cost and time Some apps even show what level of emissions there are from your trip. And it could well also include information like crowding, and as we've seen today, actually there's been announcements about crowding information being something that the Melbourne public transport app is going to include. And so you can bring in a range of these services and choices to inform people's decision making, and also enable that payment through one platform, and you're effectively having a mobility account. So this is something that cities across the world are looking at. In Melbourne, the RACV have had an app called Arrivo that they've been trialling for a few years. And the thing that we have been hearing from these operators is the ability to have really reliable real-time information about public transport, and the ability to be able to directly book and pay for tickets with a provider through that app is something that they're currently having some barriers with. Now, what the exact commercial arrangements are is something that really probably needs to be sorted out between the mobility as a service providers and the vendors of the various travel services. But what we're hearing is that there's even a step before that, though, around the availability of information and the ability to make those bookings on behalf of others. And there's a really big opportunity coming up with the Mikey re-tendering in 2023, where that can have mobility as a service operability in mind, in both the technical functions of the public transport system and also the commercial arrangements that underpin it. And we think that when you look at what Daniel's been describing about public transport fare reform, where you've got different incentives to travel on different modes at different times, that's a pretty intuitive, actually, to know that it's cheaper to travel on a bus versus a tram versus a train, and that you have on and off peak. But actually having mobility as a service makes that even more user-friendly and even easier for people to understand and make decisions. So it's really quite complementary to both getting a better user experience, but also driving better outcomes on the system itself.
Speaking about user experience, Jonathan, Daniel, I want to ask one last Mikey ticketing-based question, and it's from Daniel Jordan here. So Daniel asks, does Mikey hardware currently allow for the separation of our proposed fare structure, things like by mode, by time, by location? And could you comment on, contactless payments, EFTPOS, MasterCard, to reduce barriers to entry? I think we'll do that question. We'll end up with one last one. I'm just conscious of the time, and we'll wrap up from there. So Daniel, quick one to you.
Yeah, great. So I think that they're all doable in certain degrees. It is a matter of timing though. So the one that's most doable in the short term is probably peak and off peak. That's something that's really not too hard to do in the current system. Mode-based can be done. We've heard, it's not technically that hard, but it's going to take maybe a year to do. So there's obviously a bit of time thing there, and obviously some expense. The debit and credit stuff, I think a trial is available should we choose to do so in 2021 for the Victorian government. So that shows that, again, it is possible with the current system, and it's something that Sydney has been able to do. And that ability to use that credit and debit card is actually showing that there's what we call an accounts-based system that can be implemented, which means that those mobility as a service things are also more possible in that amount of time as well. So I think the answer is yes, they can all be done. Some of them are probably best done after 2023 just because the cost will be lower, but others of them can be done sooner and before then. And particularly those ones that relate to our main recommendations. Obviously, we're most keen to get going.
Great. Okay, last question here. Jonathan, the last one's to you before we hand back over to Michelle. And I think this rounds out our conversation quite well, but also touches on some previous work that we've done at IV. So this is from David Hardy, Secretary of Rail Futures Institute. So this is one that he sent in. How can this proposal work, the PT fare reform, unless government at the same time institutes a similar policy for essentially road user charging? Car trips on toll roads, car trips on untolled roads. How would this reform work with that, Jonathan?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So this reform absolutely can work separate to some form of road user charging, but the two are very complementary. And of course, our previous work has looked at costs of road users, costs of parking, and costs of public transport, and the options that are available to government, and using the same Melbourne activity-based model, we've been able to demonstrate the very significant benefits in terms of congestion reduction and promotion of fairness and equity of outcomes as well. What this shows is that you can introduce public transport fare reform really quite quickly with very low barriers to that change, both technical and also, to our understanding of of how the system works, and get some really good results on the public transport system, but also on the roads. Because what we find is these fare reforms take about 96,000 trips off the roads every day as well. Now, that's a contribution towards reducing congestion. It's not going to eliminate all congestion. And so it's very complementary that then if we also had some form of road user charging, either by distance or cordon-based charging in areas where there is particular congestion, often in peak periods, they work really well together. But I think the point I would make is you don't have to have road user charging to make these changes and get these big benefits at a time when we're all kind of thinking through, well, what is the better new normal? And so it would be a real shame to wait for the total package of all forms of pricing to happen when this is something that's in our hands now that we can do, can promote recovery from COVID and great long-term outcomes as well for equity and for the public transport system's efficiency.
Perfect. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you to everyone for your questions. I've tried to cover a range of everyone, and apologies if I haven't been able to get to everyone's question there. Michel, I'll leave it with you for some closing comments.
Okay, well, thank you very much to you guys to have done a good presentation of this very important reform, and we certainly feel passionately about that. So what I'd like to share with you now is that you will receive in the next few days an email from us, which will include the webinar recording, which we consider as being definitely public, so you can circulate it. A short evaluation survey, which I thank you in advance to fill in. We certainly have continuous improvement in our DNA at IV, and we'll look very carefully as to what you tell us to make sure that we take this into consideration for the next webinars, because watch that space, there will definitely be more in the future. And then there will be an email address for our inquiries inbox. So if you have a burning question that we haven't addressed this morning, the dialogue continues, the conversation continues. So please reach out to us on inquiries@infrastructurevictoria.com.au. For more information, of course, on what we're presenting to you, to access not only the IV report, but the technical reports, which we mentioned to you, the SGS1, the Center of International Economics, make sure that you visit our website under the resources section. This is an absolute gold mine of reports and technical research, which IV has commissioned for the last 5 years. We certainly pride ourselves for being a transparent and evidence-based organization, and we want to make sure that all of this work we commission from consultancy, from academics, is available to you to inform your thinking, to inform your work. So please make sure that you visit and raid our website. It is precisely designed to that purpose. And then join us on social media, as I mentioned, LinkedIn and Twitter, especially in consideration of the future big milestone for Infrastructure Victoria, which will be the release of the draft 30-year infrastructure strategy, which we'll be releasing soon after the Victorian state budget. Again, being very clear that this is the beginning of a conversation and an engagement with you. And I'm certainly looking forward to talking to you, hopefully for real, around a real coffee, to make sure that we get your input and your insights, your constructive feedback on what will be reflected in the 30-year draft strategy. And I will say that all of the recommendations we're presenting to you will be included in the 30-year infrastructure strategy. So the conversation goes on. Thank you very much for your presence today. Thank you very much for being part of the IB community, and please stay safe. Thank you very much.